right, welcome back, Art22. We're in week 5 here, and this week we are talking about something called the class. So we've actually already seen what a class is, though we didn't quite know it yet. But basically what we're going to be talking about this week with just 2 lectures is we're going to be looking at how can we create this thing called a class, which is basically a way that we can define an object in our code that we want to use, and the class basically creates like a template for that object, and then we can tell it specific things about it later and then use it in whatever way we want. Now that's kind of an abstract thought, so let's put this into something that's a bit more clear and something we've actually seen before already. So we have all seen how processing has 2D primitives, right? We can say rect for rectangle, and we give it 4 things, an x position, a y position, the width, and the height, and magically we just get a rectangle with those 4 characteristics. Now that is because processing already has a class called rectangle, or in this case rect, R-E-C-T, in which all of the math and code behind the scenes to make a rectangle happen has already been written. So let's imagine for a second that that wasn't the case, like that we wanted to make a rectangle, but the rect class didn't exist. Let's think about how annoying this would be. So we would have to first think about, okay, so what is a rectangle? Well, I guess it's a series of pixels that are, colored in some way going to the right some amount, and then some amount down, and then some amount back, and then some amount there, and that there's some XY position there, there's some width, there's some height, and then if you think about it, there's all these other parameters, right? Like rect mode, where are we drawing it from, the corner? Are we drawing it from the center? So very quickly you can see that if you had to create a rectangle from scratch every time you coded, that would be a nightmare, to say the least. So we don't want to do that, and nor did the creators of processing. So they created a class called rectangle that has all of that already baked in. And then anytime we want an instance of a rectangle, so like one version of a rectangle, all we have to tell it is what we've seen in the rectangle function, right? We say rect, and then we give it an x position, a y position, a width, and a height. Boom, that's it. That's all we have to tell it. We just have to give it the specifics, but the general idea of what a rectangle is already baked into the code, which is great. Now, that's like, as complicated as that already is, thinking about making a class of a rectangle, those are all like pretty standard things that we've been using, but we're going to see that going forward, we're going to want more complicated objects and more complicated behavior. And so we're going to learn how to make our own classes so that we basically have this template for some idea of an object. And then later when we want to make 1 or 100 of them, all we have to do is give it the specific characteristics. So in the same way that we gave x position, y position, width, height to a rectangle, we might give some very specific characteristics to our classes that we make. Okay, so the plan today, we're going to make 2 classes together. The first one is going to be more just to learn how the whole thing comes together, and it's going to be a little bit like less interesting visually, but I hope it'll help communicate how the class works. The second class we're going to make is going to be called a particle. Now we're going to be using particles a whole bunch, pretty much from now throughout the rest of the class, and so you'll get very used to them. We're going to make a particle, then we're going to make particle systems, and all the particles are going to be doing crazy different things. Basically, it's just like a dot that has some cool behavior to it, and that the behavior will change depending on how we build these particle classes. But first things first, let's think about the first class we're going to make today, which is the class human. Okay, so that's kind of weird. So let's imagine for the moment, as a bit of a thought experiment, that you were building a maybe like a virtual reality scene, or maybe you for some reason recently watched the movie The Matrix and you're like, hey, I want to build a world and code everybody in it. Okay, so if that's the case, you're gonna need some people, you're gonna need some humans in that, right? So imagine that we didn't do what we're about to do, which is make a class called human that sort of has the basic template of what a human is, and then it just needs some specifics. Let's say that we're not doing that. That means that every time you get to the part of your code where you need to make another human, you're walking down the street and you see 3 people coming, okay, so I need to code 3 humans to fill my virtual reality world. Think about all the things that would have to go into that, right? Like, not only physically would you have to be like, okay, so what would a human need? It's going to need a head geometry, it's going to need arms, it's going to need a name, it's going to need an age, it's going to need eye color, it's going to need memories. It would just be insane to think about starting from scratch every single time you wanted a new human in your world. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do something called a class called human. So our human class will have some basic things that every single human will have. So for example, our class for human, every human is going to have a name. Each human will have an age, and then we'll throw in like maybe 1 or 2 other things. But basically that means that once that's all there, once our class is created for class human, then we don't have to worry about that stuff. We can just say, give me a new human named Mark, age, whatever, boom, there it is. So just like how the function rectangle is quick and easy, that's what will happen once we've created our class. So let's jump in and get a few things set up initially, and then we'll talk about how the class is actually structured in terms of how we write the code for it, and then we'll kind of keep moving forward here. So let's get our sketch up and running. Okay, so here we are at Week 5, Class 1. Just going to be 1 lecture for Class 1 and 1 lecture for Class 2, so we don't need an A or a B. And let's do the normal things. Set up, draw, great. Probably the size is always a good idea. Okay. Now what I want us to do is go ahead and right off the bat create a new tab. So what we're going to do is have each class have its own tab. We looked at last week, or maybe it was the week before, about how we can use different tabs and functions to keep our code a bit more organized. And this is no exception. So I'm going to go to this little arrow. I'm going to say new tab. And this tab is going to be the tab that's going to hold our class that we create called human. So there we go. Human. Okay, great. Now let's take a quick look at kind of the anatomy here of a class. I'm going to switch over to the other screen real fast. Okay. So every class, at least all the ones that we're going to be making for pretty much the rest of this course, are going to have 3 kind of general sections to them. So first things first, we're going to have the class, and its name. So in this case, human is the name of our class. That's a curly bracket, despite what it looks like. Okay. Now, 3 sections for a class. The first thing is kind of like how on our main tab, sometimes if we want a variable that's global, meaning we can use it anywhere in our code, we define those at the top. We're going to do the same thing for our class. So any variables that we're going to need to build our class, we're going to define right at the beginning. So for example, for our human class, this is where we're going to define like, or initiate, I should say. This is where we're going to initiate things like, an integer for age, a string for name, and so on. So we're going to call this variables. Great. Now, the second section is probably the most confusing at first. It's called the constructor. So the constructor is basically a little bit what it seems. It's what it sounds like, which is this is the part of the code where later when we want to create a particular instance of our class, so when we want to make a particular human, just like if we wanted to have a particular rectangle, this is the thing that we actually need to tell processing, the thing we actually have to code out to create a new version. So the constructor for the rectangle function is what we've seen, rect, x, y, width, height. Our constructor for a human class would be human, name, age, whatever. So the next section here, lost my, there we go, will be the constructor. Okay, so we'll get into that soon. Now the final section is kind of where all the action happens. So this is basically where we put any like functions or methods that we need for if our class is going to be doing anything. So for example, our particle class we're going to make after this is going to have some movement behavior. So that we might need a function called like update position or movement or something like that. But one thing most functions most classes will need is a function to actually display whatever the class is. So for example, our human class, we're not actually going to like sketch out a human. We're just going to have the information about that human show up as text on our screen. So we're going to have a maybe a display or render function where basically we're just going to show the information about the human. So that would be something that would go into this kind of functions section of our class. So we'll say functions. Okay, so that's the three parts of the class. We have the overall container, which is the name of it, in this case human. Then we have necessary variables. We have the constructor, which is what we're going to be using later to make one example of a class. And then finally we have whatever functions or methods we need to have our class do the things we want it. That's what happens in the bottom section. Okay, so let's build this human class and see how it works. Okay, so first things first, we need to kind of create that container. So each class, not surprisingly, starts with the word class. And now we just need to name our class. So we're going to call it human. And then a curly bracket, and then let's leave a little bit of space and another curly bracket. Okay. So I said that the first section of our class is going to be any necessary variables for creating our class. So in this case, let's just make 3 variables for the class. So let's make a string which will have the name of this particular human. Let's have an integer for the age. And let's do something different. Let's say we want a float called coffee, which is going to be the number of cups of coffee this human has had so far today. Okay. So let's leave it there, right? So that's all we need for our human at the moment. Just in the same way that if we were building a class for rectangle, this probably would have been 4 different integers or floats maybe for x position, y position, width, and height. But for our human, we just want this other kind of information. Okay, so here's a little bit of the weird part. We need to make this constructor. So what this is going to be, what will I need to say to create a specific instance of the human class. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So if you remember, for the rect version, right, for the rectangle, it was like rect, and then you have, width or x, y, blah, blah, blah. For ours, we're going to use the name of our class, which is human. So we say human, and let's give it some parentheses. Okay. Now let's give it, this is probably the weirdest part, which is what we need to do is we're going to put in kind of like some placeholder variables. So these will be sort of like placeholders for what we will type into it later. And then we're going to use these variables that go in here to set our name, age, and coffee variable. That it's a little bit hard just to hear that, so let's just see what it looks like. That's probably the best way to understand. So we know that later when we create a particular instance of our human, we're going to be telling it a name. So for example, I'm going to later make a class of human called Mark. So someone, me in this case, is going to be passing an argument into our human function here that first has a string for name. So I'm just going to use n as kind of a placeholder for name. And we know that they will also be telling us an age. So let's say int a for age. And we know that they'll be giving us amount of coffee this person has had. So let's go with C for coffee. So basically these are like placeholders for what we will be telling processing later about our human that we're creating. And then we'll use these, N, A, and C, to set our name, age, and coffee variable. It's a little bit of a confusing idea, but we're going to be making so many classes in this course, that I think it's one of those things where you just like the more and more you do it, the more and more it like kind of starts to reveal itself. But we'll keep at it here. So I just said that later I'm going to say human, mark, age, coffee amount. So then what we need to do is basically say, okay, so this class's name is going to equal whatever we tell it later. So n is like the placeholder for that. So I'm going to have it equal n. Okay. Now age of our class, human, is going to equal whatever we tell it later, which will be stored in a. So then we just say a. And then finally, same thing with coffee and C. Our coffee variable is going to equal whatever we tell it later, which is stored in the variable C. So for example, later in the code, I'm going to say something like human mark 31 2.5. And those three things that I tell it will be set to our name, age, and coffee variable. And that's it. That's the constructor. So we have some curly brackets that keep track of that variable assignment here. And that's all we need for our constructor. Great. Okay, so now how about this last part, which is like where all the functions are. So why don't we call this, I like to call it methods. You can think about it as functions as well, but I'm going to stick with methods for now. Okay, so we decided that what we really want is to just display some text that will show the information about our human on the screen. So I'm going to make a function called void display. How about? Okay, get some curly brackets. So this function is going to display this information, name, age, and coffee. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. So some of you have maybe come across the text function, but we've seen how we can print things to the screen with this. But we can also put text on our window with the text function. And basically what text needs to work is it needs whatever text we actually want to show, and then it needs a position of where we want that text to appear on our screen. So first things first, like what text do we actually want to show? Well, we want to show our name of the human, plus I'm gonna do a little bit of formatting here so it's easier to read. So I'm gonna add a space, Now I'm going to add the age. I'm going to add another space. And now I'm going to add copy. Great. So basically what this is saying is show the text of our name variable, age, and copy variable separated by a space with this quote, space, quote. Okay. And then now we said we need an X and a Y position for where we want this text to show up. So maybe it would be a good idea actually to have a X and a Y variable that we will use here for the location of our text. And maybe let's say that X will equal mouse X and Y will equal mouse Y. So basically we're going to draw the text that has all the information about our human wherever our mouse is. Okay. So that right there is your first class. Well, I don't know if it's your first class, but it's our first class together. How about that? Okay, so we had our necessary variables. We had our constructor, where we're actually kind of specifying all the little bits here. And then finally we have our methods, in this case where we're displaying the information about our human. Great. So this is basically akin to having defined the concept of a rectangle so that now we can use it later. We've just defined a very simple concept of a human, basically reducing it down to name, age, and how much coffee they drink, which honestly some days feels like pretty much all it's about. So now let's actually make one version of our human. So I'm going to come back over here to our main tab. All right. So how can we go about this? Well, if you remember, for things like, anytime we declare a variable, we'd say something like, float X or something, or maybe we wanted an image, P image, or whatever it might be. Well, in this case, the class that we want is the class human. So we're going to say human. So that's the class type. And now we need a name of this particular human. So I'm going to go with Mark, because that makes sense for me. Feel free to use your own name. So I've just now initialized a class of human and named it specifically Mark. So this particular class will be named Mark. Okay. This is, made me think about it like, our group, Art22, has, 29 humans in it or whatever it is. Each of you has a different name. So we are all of type human, but with different names. Okay. So now that we've initialized this, we need to actually use that constructor to give it all the necessary information. So we can do that in setup here. So I'm going to say Mark is equal to a new human. So this is the syntax for how we create a new instance of a class. We say new and then the name of the class. So Mark is going to be a new human. And now remember, if we look at our constructor, we need to tell it three things. We need to tell it a string for the name, an integer for the age, and a float for the amount of coffee. So my name is Mark. Great. My age is 31. And the number of cups of coffee I've had today thus far is 1.5. There we go. We now have a new human named Mark that has some information. Okay, so let me add a few comments here. So we're going to say use constructor to set information about this particular human. And then we'll say initialize a class of human named Mark. Great. Okay, so we've made our class human. we've made one example of a human class called Mark. We've told it what information that wants to go into this class, or this instance of the class. Now we actually want to see that text that we were talking about, that display function. So how can we do that? Well, first things first, I'm going to draw a background. There we go. Okay. Now, when we want to run a function that's in the class, so for example, we have one right now called display. So when I want to run display, we need to tell processing which, for which instance of our class human do we want to run that display function. So all that really means, this kind of sounds fancy and scary, is that we want to run the display function, but we want to do it for particularly for the class instance Mark. So we want to say Mark.display. So let's run Mark's display function. Because we might have, a whole bunch of classes, a whole bunch of humans with different names, but right now we just want to see display the text for the human class called Mark. Okay. Let's see what we get when we run this thing finally. A little slow. There we go. All right. So we can see that at my mouse location, we have the information about the human Mark. We have his name, Mark. I've never said my name this many times. We have his age, 31, and we have the amount of coffee Mark has had thus far today, which is 1.5 cups. Okay, great. So that's not super exciting yet. I mean, it's a little exciting, right? Because we have we never need to rewrite all that human code. We can just make new examples of humans based off of the class human. So that's pretty cool already. And I think the extent of how cool it is will come into play when we start making crazy particle systems and things like that in the next lecture. But one thing that is really awesome about having a class is that because it's keeping track of all this information for us, name, age, and coffee, we can at any point make changes to those variables, and it's going to keep track of that as well for us. So let's see an example of what I mean by that. So let's say we want to make our human not just a static object, so it's not just name something and has a fixed age and has a fixed amount of coffee. What if I age, or what if I drink more coffee, or what if I change my name? Well, in that case, we want to have some kind of interaction to make these changes. So what I'm going to do, down here at the bottom, I'm going to make a function for mouse released. Now, quick tangent here. Let's think about what the difference is between using something like mouse released and mouse pressed. Mouse pressed could be happening for any amount of time, right? Like I'm currently holding my mouse down and it's been maybe 5 seconds, So that is some kind of continuous state, right? The mouse is pressed for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 10 minutes. Mouse released is a discrete event. When I release my mouse, it happens exactly one time. So if you're thinking about interaction with a mouse or the keyboard, you might think about what kind of interaction do you want? Do you want something to happen exactly once each time you press your mouse, for example? Well, in that case, you probably want mouse released because mouse released only happens once. If you want something to keep happening while you're pressing your mouse, that would probably be an opportunity to use mouse pressed. So just a quick note about why I decided to use mouse released. The reason being is every time I click, I want to change something about the Mark human here. Let me make a little comment here that says display Mark's information. Okay. All right, so let's say that Mark is having an existential crisis, and every time the mouse is released, he is going to age by 1 year. Well, how do we know how to increment something by 1? We have seen that plus plus is our friend for that, right? So if I write this, what this is saying is get Mark's age, get the age variable associated with Mark, and just increase it by 1 every time I release the mouse. So increase Mark's age, sad, every mouse click. I don't know what that looks like, but it was not a sad face. There we go. Okay. So let's check that out. I'm gonna run this here. Something's unhappy. That's odd. Okay, momentary glitch. Not sure what that was. Things are running a bit slow today. There we go. Okay, so there I am, marked 31, 1.5. Aha, now every time I click, see the years of my life just counting away. But what hopefully this illustrates is that by having a class keeping track of all these variables, all this information for us, it makes it very easy to sort of maintain an object but change features about it. Okay, so just for fun, let's do, actually, here's what we're gonna do. So the last thing we're gonna do with this human, let's make one more example of a human. This is gonna show why it's nice to have a class for this and not have to remake it every time. So let's say we want a new human, and we're gonna call the new human, oh, I don't know, we need a name. How about Paul? I'm currently rereading Dune, so the name Paul is fresh in my mind. Okay, so Paul is going to be a new human named Paul. That makes sense. I believe in the book he's like 15 or something like that. And I don't think Paul drinks coffee, so he has had 0 coffee that day. Okay. Now, if we want to display Paul's information, we're going to say Paul.display. And that's that. So let's comment out my information for a second and just look at if we see Paul's. There we go. Paul, 15, 0 coffee. Great. Now, let's say somebody introduced Paul to coffee and his mind was blown. But that means that we're going to start drinking a lot more coffee. So perhaps Paul.coffee plus equals 5. Maybe he's like a total psycho and just drinks 5 cups of coffee at a time. Increase Paul's coffee consumption by a lot. Let's say. All right, so let's check this out. Okay, there's Paul. Boom, he just drank 5 cups of coffee. 5 more. 15. He's probably not alive at this point. Okay, so that is kind of our first idea about a class. We named it human. We had particular humans, Mark and Paul, who have unique features, but they share the common idea of having a name, of having an age, of having a coffee amount, but those will differ. Okay, so let's switch over for a second. So that hopefully illustrates kind of how a class works and why it's interesting to use it and why it's really actually very helpful to use it, because now we can start making, you can imagine maybe we want, and we'll see this in the next lecture, maybe we want hundreds of our object, of our class. Doing it by scratch each time would just be completely insane. So we're gonna get used to the class and how to make interesting complex behavior happen with classes. So to start getting after that, we're going to just make one more class today, and that's going to be actually something that's more interesting to see. So we're going to take some of the ideas we've already seen in our course so far about having a particle or a point or something moving around on the screen. But now we're going to basically make a class called particle that will store all the information for how we want that particle to move. And then we'll draw it on the screen in the same way that we use the display function for our human class. And so what this is going to allow us to do is at the end of this lecture, we could have something like 2 different instances of our particle, but they could have different attributes. So we could have 2 particles, but maybe one is a different color, maybe they're different sizes, maybe they move in different directions, something like that. So let's just put together this one other class, and then we'll see in the next lecture how we can make a whole bunch of classes together. So let's take a look at that. So just like our human class, we're going to make a new tab for our particle class. Great. And what we want is to do basically the exact same thing we did before. We're going to make a class with all 3 of the required sections, the variables, the constructor, and the methods. So first things first, class called particle. Get some curly brackets. Okay. So let's say what we want to do is basically just draw some really basic movement of a 2D primitive. How about a point? So basically we just want to have a point moving on our screen like we've seen before in lectures. So nothing new in terms of what we're actually putting into our class. So necessary variables, we're going to want probably a float for x and y position. We're going to want a float for size of our particle. We're going to want maybe a speed variable for x and a speed variable for y. Okay, great. I think that's really all we need. So we're going to have a point moving around at some position x, y. It's going to have some size, and it's going to be moving with some speed in each direction. Cool. All right, so let's get this constructor going. Constructor. So we always start with the name of our class as the first part of our constructor. And now if you remember from our human, we just need the placeholder variables that will be assigned to our actual variables. So one way you can do placeholders that I find sometimes useful for kind of clarity's sake is I actually name the sort of dummy kind of placeholder variables the same name as our variable, but just with like an underscore after it. So they can't be the same name, but they could be very similar. So for example, the placeholder variable for x will just be x underscore. Float y underscore. Float size underscore. Can't type. Float speed x underscore. Float speed y underscore. Okay. All right, so these again, so later when we actually make a particle, we're going to be giving it specific values, right? We might say like width divided by 2, height divided by 2, 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 4 pixels, you know. So we're going to be giving it specific information, but these are the placeholders for that. So then we do exactly what we did with our human class, where we just set these equal to these. So x is equal to x underscore, y equals to y underscore, size underscore, speed x. This is a bit of a, not the most exciting part of creative coding. But luckily we only have to do it once, right? That's the beauty of the class. Okay, so now each of our actual variables is set to the ones that are getting passed to us later when we use our constructor. And so that's good to go. Okay, so now we need whatever methods we want here, right? So let's, just like with the human, let's just have a display function. Okay. So what do we want to display? Well, we want to display a point. So let's get a few attributes of point. So we know that the way we set the size of a point is with stroke weight. In this case, what do we want to use for the size of our stroke weight? Well, let's use our size variable, right? So we're going to say size. Great. What stroke do we want? Let's just say that they're all going to be white. We have no variation in our in the color for our class, but we do have variation in like size and speed and things like that. Okay, so now let's actually draw the point. And where do we want to draw it? Well, we want to draw it at x and y because those are the position variables that we said. And finally, we want to make this thing move around, right? So we can say y equals, I'm sorry, x equals x plus speed x. You could also say x plus equals speed x, up to you. Y equals y plus speed y. And there is our first particle class. We're going to be seeing a lot of particle classes for the rest of this term. So yeah, that's just a fact. Okay, so here's our particle. We have variables, we construct it, and then we put some things in our display so that we actually see something happening. Great. So now what we need to do is actually create an instance of our particle. So just like we did that with human, we can do that with particle. So we want a new particle. Let's say we want this first particle to be called particle, how about just P? So we'll say new initialize a particle named P. Great. Now we're going to use this constructor to set up the information about this particle. So P is a new particle. Great. And now we need to tell it a handful of things, right? We need to tell it the x, y position of its initial location. We need to give it a size and then speed for x and y. Okay. And these are all floats, so that's good to remember. So we're going to say width divided by 2. Let's start it in the middle of our screen. Height divided by 2. All right, we need a size. Why don't we say it's 10 pixels? And now we need a speed. So how about x speed is 2 and y speed is 1. Great, so there's our new particle. It now has all of its variables set through the constructor. And now we need to display it. So to run the display function, we can just say p dot display. So you'll notice, I've said display for here, but because I said Paul, processing knows, okay, we're going to be running the display function in the human class for the human named Paul. When I say p dot display, processing knows we're going to be running the display function in the particle class for the particle called P. All right, let's check that out. And there it goes. Very cool. Okay, Paul's still there. Still drinking insane amounts of coffee. Okay, so last thing we're going to do today. Why don't we make one more particle, particle Q. We're going to say Q is a new particle. Maybe what we want is we want to have its initial position be a random value, 0 to width, let's say. So we're going to have it start anywhere on our screen, random 0 to height. So randomized x position and y position. So still the idea of position is there, but now these particles can have different specific information. Okay. Now let's say that it still will be 10 pixels big, but maybe now this direction is going to be reversed from our other particle. Okay, cool. So now what we need to do is run its display function. Okay, let's see what we get here. I'm going to comment out our Paul display for the moment, just to have the two particles. And there they are. Great. So hopefully that illustrates the idea that if we can make two particles and display their different information, related but different information, you know, we could start to build some really complex things, right? We could have thousands of particles that each have their own specifics, but that that we don't have to write a whole bunch of code to make that complex system happen. Now, there's one thing that we haven't done with our particles, which is changing something about it, right? So one thing we could do is down here. We saw that we were able to change something about our particle, I'm sorry, our humans just by clicking the mouse. You know, we changed the age or the coffee. Why don't we say we're going to change the size of, how about particle Q every time it clicks? Maybe particle Q.size will get bigger by 5 pixels every time we click. So plus equals 5 to the size of particle Q. Let's check that out. Okay. It's a little hard to see because it was already started pretty far to the left. Let's just try it again. All right, there we go. Now it's getting bigger. Great. Now you can imagine, you know, maybe not using mouse interaction. Maybe you use the position of its x coordinate to affect the size or something like that. But the general idea of being able to have the idea of something, in this case a particle, create specific versions of that idea, so specific particles that have different behavior, different information, different behavior, and then displaying them together without having to write a whole bunch of code each time. That is the whole idea of the class and why we use it. It's a lot to take in, but we're going to have so much practice with classes going forward that it'll start to become very familiar. In the next lecture, we're going to be seeing how we can make a whole bunch of classes without needing to say this each time. So we're not going to have to write 100 of these lines to make 100 particles. We're going to use the power of our loops to make a whole bunch of particles for us. So that will be in the next class. But thank you for hanging in there, and we'll see you next time.